Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today from the great state of Mississippi is Morgan Gates. Morgan, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Chris. How about you?
I'm really doing well today and glad to have you with us.
I'm
Morgan is a licensed battlefield guide at Vicksburg National Military Park and an expert on John Pemberton. And I had Pemberton on the brain and needed to talk to somebody. So
well,
I understand, Morgan, you're the guy for me to have to talk to.
well, no, I seem to be the expert by default, if for no other reasons.
You say by default. That makes me think that there are not a lot of people out there who want to be John Pemberton experts.
Well, it's sort of an interesting story because met Kurt Fields, plays U.S. Grant a number of years back, and a friend of mine was putting together a program here in Vicksburg. We called it Breakfast of Generals. This is back about 2017 or something like this. And of course, Kurt was ready to come down and portray. We needed somebody to play Pemberton. And so my friend turned to me and said, you got the right beard, so maybe you need to step up and do this. And I said, okay, well, I guess somebody's got to play the loser. So I started trying to crawl into Pemberton's head and discovered that this is a very misunderstood general in the Civil War. A lot of things that people just sort of glance over and say, oh, he was incompetent. Oh, blah, blah, blah. They don't really understand the full picture here. So he's an interesting character. It's somewhat tragic. I said he does get blamed, and I think a lot of that is actually what we call the spin doctoring by certain politicians and political animals and stuff of the time and the time thereafter. So it's an interesting character nonetheless.
Yeah. So, and to me, that's pretty. I mean, he's just one of those people that we all kind of find it easy to make fun of him.
Mm-hmm.
Might be a good way of put it. But as you got to know him, you have really kind of found all these different complexities. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's unfortunate that a lot of people just kind of stay with the joke and don't take that time.
Yeah.
What was it like for you to kind of dig in like that?
Well, again, I discovered that this man was actually. I tell people today, if you were a modern personnel person in human resources, and you had John C. Pemberton's resume on your desk and Grant's resume at the same time, you'd probably have thrown Grant's away and hired Pemberton. He had the background. I mean, he was of a fine Philadelphia family. He had been appointed to West Point by none other than President Andrew Jackson. His father had been a good friend of Andrew Jackson. They were of what they call fighting Quaker stock, and the family had originally been Quaker, but his father had left the fold, and so John C. Pemberton stuff is going to pursue a military career. He's going to be in the Army pretty much his entire adult life. Unlike Grant, he's not going to have any stints where he comes out and becomes civilian. And if you actually look at all the things he was involved in, he was actually a pretty experienced general. He was fought in the Mexican-American War, got promoted to brevet captain, was wounded, later on be promoted to be the General Worth's aide de camp. And actually, that's his position where he and Grant first come in contact with each other. Grant was a young brevet lieutenant in the same division. And Grant, of course, did some brave things there too. And so he'll get a commendation from General Worth. And General Worth sends his aide to go get young Grant. That aide was Brevet Major John C. Pemberton. So the men had met, he had remained in the Army. He had been participated in several battles. He had fought before that. He had fought in the Seminole Wars in Florida. He'll be on the Mormon expedition right under Robert E. Lee after the war is over. And again, he's the man who's been there and done that. And he gets criticized a lot by saying, oh, he had no combat experience. Well, yes, he did. And you must understand that when the Civil War first starts, there's a lot of people who have had no combat experience. It's very much an on-the-job training type war.
So some interesting hypocrisies there then, as people sort of kind of sketch Pemberton's career out and make these assumptions, or it's like, well, actually he does have this and he does that. Yeah. Is it now he gets stationed in Norfolk for a while,
Yeah.
and is that sort of where he starts to develop his Southern leanings?
He has even before early in his life, he and his father, when his father was still alive, they had sort of liked Virginia. and they had been having some discussions about buying land in Virginia. Virginia, of course, a very beautiful part of the world, stuff like this. So he had some leanings, stuff like this. He falls in love with a young lady, and of course marries her. She's in Virginia and stuff like this. So his heart started leaning toward Virginia, I think. Again, he knew a lot of the West Point guys who will later on be serving in the Confederate Army or in the old Army. So again, he was a man who knew these guys. And so when the war came, he initially was actually still in the Union Army, in his artillery battery right there along the Potomac. And his wife is Virginian, keeps sending letters. John, where you come and join us? When you come to join us? President Davis has positions for you. So I sort of consider the man of following his heart as he went south. Again, he knew the people of the South. He loved Virginia. His wife was Virginia, and so when it came down to it, the man followed his heart. So how many?
That's why I'm in Virginia.
How many of us would not have made that same decision? Are you going to turn against the place where your family is? Because they were in Virginia. I mean, he's going to go invade Virginia with the rest of the Union Army. I don't think most men would have made that decision. But
now I understand it too, that because he had this great West Point experience and he knew all these officers, like they vouched for his loyalty to the South when the war broke out. I mean, they knew that he had been leaning in in the sort of philosophical direction the South was taken. So it wasn't like a kind of my wife says I'm going to do this kind of thing, but a really deep-seated conviction, right?
And he was not the only Northerner fighting for the South. And of course, there were Southerners fighting for the North. People forget how divided our country was. This is not simply, if I'm Northerner, Mason, Dixon line, I'm loyal to the Union. If I'm South, I'm uniformly Confederate. And there are actually examples throughout the Civil War in just about every place where there are certain people who say, okay, this is a just war. We're fighting for our second American Revolution. And those who say, no, the Union is right and we need to stop this. And so that was a not uncommon thing. In fact, one of Pemberton's subordinates here in Vicksburg, Martin Luther Smith, was a New Yorker. Right. So again, he was not alone in being a Northern man fighting for the South.
Now, I'm kind of maybe jumping ahead in the story here a little bit, but how does the war then impact Pemberton's marriage, since he is married to a Virginian, and it is, personal loyalty to her is a big reason why he does go with the South? How does that play out on the home front for him?
It seemed to be no problem at all. I mean, she understood the duty. Again, she's the one who encouraged him to come south and join the Confederacy and stuff like this. Now, obviously, she'll not be following him very closely around the battlefields, which I wouldn't take my wife if I were in the Army as well to the battlefields. Although, it doesn't seem to be a problem. He has a good family life. Of course, he'll be blamed for things after Vicksburg, but he'll return to family life, and by all means, had a good family life. So, couldn't speak out at all. By the way, go ahead.
Oh no! So when he finally does then decide to throw his lot in with the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis has a position for you. Tell us a little bit about kind of how he fits in as. And that's a very tumultuous time as the Confederacy's forming, the Virginia State Militia is getting incorporated, so it's a lot of moving parts for him to try to slide into as a Northerner.
Right, it is. Yes. Again, he's going to be a permanent rank of captain when he leaves the Union Army. So he'll be promoted. He'll be a general. He's actually going to move down, and one of his first assignments. Again, there was a good bit of a sort of a relatively close relationship between him and President Davis. After the war is over, there'll be correspondence about how he had tried to come join Davis as he was evacuating Richmond, but couldn't get there, and various things like this. So there was some personal acquaintance, maybe a bit of friendship. I wouldn't say they were really close friends, but there was some relationship there here and Davis. And one of his first big assignments, he'll be down in South Carolina. He was actually right there with Robert E. Lee. At this point, this is before Robert E. Lee has actually taken over the big job, if you will. Joe Johnson's still the chief general. And so they're going to be signing defensives of Charleston. Then when Joe Johnson's wounded and Robert E. Lee moves up to take that position, then he will be left with the defense of Charleston. And that's where the problems really start to begin. His northern birth made him sort of suspicious to many people in the South. A lot of people just really couldn't, at least in this area he was in, really couldn't grasp the idea of a northern man really being trustworthy at this time. A friend of his, and I forget the exact name of who told him this, once told him to be careful when he went to South Carolina, because there are only two kind of people in Charleston: those who have never worn shoes and those that will make you feel if you have never worn shoes. Apologies to anybody from Charleston who's watching today. So there was a good bit of enmity there between him and some of the leading citizens. One of the problems was he refused to divulge his plans about how to defend Charleston. And that's not something exactly you want to be spilling at the local cocktail parties or something like that. And so he just basically says, this is classified, this is not your business, you're civilians, and that just makes people angry, and especially the governor of South Carolina, was Pickens this time, if I remember correctly, and he keeps writing these nasty letters to Jeff Davis about this man and stuff like this, and it just all finally comes to a head, and Jeff Davis and Pemberton are pretty much in agreement. It's time to go somewhere else. So he then is moved over to Mississippi, which of course is Jeff Davis's pretty much hometown, Vicksburg. He was not born in Vicksburg, but he was lived pretty much his entire adult life in Vicksburg, Mississippi area. His plantation, Briarfield, was only about 15 miles south of Vicksburg today. So
with the Charleston situation, and a lot of it is just bias because he's a Yankee,
right?
Folks in Charleston notoriously prickly, as you sort of alluded to, and there's that pride being the cradle of secession for South Carolina and the first shot. So I mean, there's a political component to that. That is Pemberton equipped to be in that kind of political environment?
He is not. I would not call him very politically savvy at all. He was, again, not a lot there. I think he just does not really understand how to work the crowd, if you will. And again, I'm sure that had he been a little more politically savvy or something like this, he probably could have smoothed things over and smoothed some of the right people and stuff like this. But that was just not his way. Again, he was the impression I always got of him is this very sort of stiff, formal military man, right way, wrong way, the army way, so to speak. And I'm sure that probably didn't help his situation in South Carolina a lot. So again, as we well know, Grant wasn't the best at politics himself. So,
well, but I understand, like from a military point of view, his defensive strategy around Charleston was pretty solid, and he's, he knows what he's doing as far as those defenses and being prepared, and yet. Because maybe the civilians don't know how to appreciate that aspect of it, they're a little less forgiving because he's so quiet about it, maybe.
Yes, very much so. And again, this is a certain amount of entitlement among the planter class in that area. They're sort of used to getting their way, if you will. And I can always sort of imagine them, well, General Pemberton, how do you propose to defend our city? And when he doesn't divulge the detailed tactics or something like this, and I'm sure, to my knowledge, I've never seen any actually recording of what was said back and forth, but I could always imagine myself, well, sir, those are military matters. We have a plan and we'll execute it. Trust me. And again, that just didn't fly. That just didn't fly with something. Again, that self-entitlement, that privileged class of people. It was the old South in many ways. And of course, as South Carolina was the old South, So Yes, it's not a situation that really played to Pemberton's advantage in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And, let's be honest, he would have reason to be concerned that those secrets would get divulged. And, there are stories of all sorts of other generals who have aggravations because their plans get leaked. And Stonewall
That,
Jackson, notoriously secret
right.
because, yeah.
Yes,
So,
exactly. Again, this is not anything out of the normal. In fact, it would actually, I would have said, been a detriment to him if he had shared the plans. I would have made him very questionable. I think his sound military tactics, strategic thinking, if he simply divulged his plans to whoever. So he's doing the right thing. But again, where a more southern gentleman, perhaps of proper ancestry, if you will, might have given a pass. This damn Yankee was not. So,
wow.
again, no offense to damn Yankees watching.
Being one myself, right? Yeah, but obviously Davis must have recognized that Pemberton was doing something right because he doesn't send him off to some backwater. He sends him
Yes,
basically to Davis's hometown, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And when he moves there, and this is the fall of '62, I believe it was October, if I remember correctly, he comes in there in this department. He was in charge of Mississippi and the eastern parts of Louisiana. So basically, all the parts of Louisiana on the east side of the Mississippi River. That's his area of operation. It's tremendous territory. Um, he comes in here. This area had been rather poorly managed before, and things just hadn't been handled right. And so he starts organizing. He starts, getting things in a good military order, starts making things for supply, make sure fortifications are built. And by all accounts, he's doing an excellent job. And the government of Mississippi is actually very happy with him at this time. And so he's actually doing quite a good job. But one of the big problems is he's got too much territory and too little resources.
Hmm.
He knows a lot of his shortcomings. He knows he doesn't have enough men. He knows he doesn't have enough big guns. And one of the most important things he does not have enough cavalry. Cavalry is his eyes and ears. Most of his best cavalry have been pulled away early in the war up into the Tennessee area. And he's been begging for it back, and just not happening. So.
Yeah. And I think maybe also a complicating factor is Earl Van Dorn, who had been in his position in charge in Mississippi, is now the guy in charge of a lot of that cavalry, and he's trying to redeem himself, right? And so, and I can't recall anything where Van Dorn's like, I'm going to stick it to Pemberton, but you got to think there's something that complicates that.
Van Dorn was I a little too interested in the ladies and stuff like this, right? He was a player, as you well know, he would actually be killed by a jealous husband before the siege of Vicksburg begins. He was, of course, very famously the man who led the cavalry raid that burned Holly Springs, and caused Grant to turn back in the winter of 1862. So he was a very dashing man. But I think he was more of a playboy than he was a really good administrator there. So again, nothing that I've read has seen anything that there was any personal sour grapes there. But again, such things might not have made it into the written records anyway. So I'm sure that could have been some stuff, but nothing that really pops to mind. So
yeah. And now, because Van Dorn had presented a command problem for Jefferson Davis, Pemberton needs a job. Is this we're going to give this to Pemberton just because I need to get rid of Van Dorn, or is Pemberton truly and legitimately on his own the right man for this job?
I think he was, at least in Davis's eyes. Understand, Pemberton is a good, solid soldier. He has seen the elephant, as they said in the days. He had a good record of being aides of various generals, so he understood how military matters need to be organized. And a lot of what the problem in Mississippi was in those earliest days was just things weren't organized. So you get over here, you get things organized, you get things set up. You need to defend your river cities. Of course, what was he just doing? He was working with defense in Charleston. So here's a man who's just gotten through working on that. He can go over here and start fortifying Vicksburg and other points along the river. So I think he thought he was a good man for the job. Now, in hindsight, we can look back and we look at, say, Grant versus Pemberton, and we think, oh, by compared to Grant, oh no, he's nothing. Well, understand, very few people in the Civil War would have stood up to Grant's qualities or something like that. So I tell people, you might be pretty good at playing a pick up basketball, but you go up against Kobe Bryant, you're going to lose. Okay. And so Grant was the man with the plan at the time. So it's sort of a, I think, unfair comparison to really say talk so bad about Pemberton compared to Grant, because Grant beat everybody basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And at that point in the war, we don't know how the story is going to end. So it's not necessarily, that Grant is Kobe Bryant at that point.
Exactly. He
He's
hasn't made
becoming, yeah.
And really, a lot of people looked at Grant this time as basically a drunk who was just sort of gotten lucky. So I'm sure in Davis's mind, oh, Grant will be no problem. Wow, Pemberton will go over and get organized, get everything fortified, everything right up, and this will be a slam dunk. And of course, history has proven other matters, but again, they didn't have the hindsight that we do today. So
yeah, I think also, Davis, because it's his hometown, he knows the area really well. There's a strong reliance on the topography
right
around Vicksburg. And so, like, even if maybe Pemberton's not the right guy, or even if Grant, whatever, like, this is still such a strong position that, we're going to really lean on that. That obviously becomes problematic for Pemberton as the campaign eventually unfolds. Um, how does he feel about that? Is he kind of thinking that's the right idea?
topography, you mean? Oh, he's actually very much for it. He's respects it, is just astounded by the terrain around Vicksburg, and he understands just how important Vicksburg was. Once he got here, he really see it. And in his own words, he says he can see Vicksburg to be the single most important point in the Confederacy. And now, of course, what that does is, of course, Vicksburg, because of its high bluffs, and most places along the river are flat, swampy. Vicksburg's on a series of. Sorry about that.
That's right.
Sorry, got to silence the phone. All right, Vicksburg's high on bluffs. That makes it a strong fortification, place to fortify. Its position on the river, the stretch of river that the Confederates are still holding at this time, is from Vicksburg on the north to Port Hudson, just north of Baton Rouge on the south. It includes the mouth of the Red River. That means men and supplies from as far west as Texas can be but on steamboats down to Mississippi up to Vicksburg, and right here at Vicksburg there are railheads at east. And it was the major highway of supplies from the west. And its position on the bluffs made it much easier to defend than a more level spot would have been. So he understood the importance of Vicksburg. And I think he was actually good with that. So again, not a problem to him, a problem to Grant, as we'll see later on with the failure of the first two assaults and the other, then will force him to besiege the city for 47 days.
Yeah. There's also the complicating factor that we haven't talked about of Joe Johnston, who
Right.
comes to the West. He's in charge of both Western armies in Tennessee and in Mississippi. And he's got different views about defense than Jefferson Davis does. And
Right.
he tells Pemberton, who's his direct subordinate, preserve your forces, stay mobile, don't sacrifice your army. Whereas Davis is telling Pemberton, don't give up the geography.
Right.
And uh, to me, that puts Pemberton in the most impossible spot of any commander.
He's the man in the middle. He really is. Here's the problem. Now, of course, today we understand that Joe Johnston was right, because we do not try to stand and defend fixed points so much anymore as we try to go out and meet the enemy before he gets here. Again, a very forward-looking way of thinking. However, it completely ignores the fact that the physical place that Vicksburg had to be held, because that was their supply line from the west. because they were actually bringing things through medicine, excuse me, out of Mexico. They could be coasted along the coast of Texas and little inland inlets and stuff inside the blockades. They get them up the Red River on the steamboats, Vicksburg rails headed east. And so, even though today we don't really try to do hold the place, Pemberton has been ordered by Jefferson Davis to hold Vicksburg at all costs. And then Joe Johnson says basically get the army out of Vicksburg. So what do? Well, presidents outrank generals in most places. So, and of course, as we well know, the Confederate government was written almost a word for word copy of the American Constitution, the United States Constitution, except for issues about slavery. So again, the president's the chief executive. He's the head of the army. The president says, hold the place. Yes, sir. We hold the place. So Pemberton's doing his job. Again, that's one thing he can't seem to get Johnson to understand, is that he's got to hold Vicksburg because he's been ordered to do so by the president. Johnson keeps telling him to come out. But by the same token, while Johnson's telling him to come out, Johnson's not coming out. So sort of makes a problem there for Pemberton. He's sort of the man in the middle there.
Yeah. I've got nothing good to say about Joe Johnson in Mississippi. Nothing good.
No show Joe is like no show Joe.
Because he even says, like, I'm going to come out and meet you, and then doesn't. He marches in the opposite direction.
Sitting over there north of Jackson, a member of the Coldstream Guard, a British observer, writes his first. Johnson seems to be making no move to relieve Vicksburg. A young man from Kentucky, sitting on camp with his regiment on the banks of the Pearl River. The river runs through Jackson. Says, we sat here every day waiting for the word to go relieve Vicksburg, and one day we couldn't hear the guns, and we knew Vicksburg had fallen. So, yeah, Johnson seemed to be making no moves. And throughout the siege, Pemberton just begging, if you come here, you move here and attack along here, I'll try to make a diversion, or I'll try to break out over here. So, and Johnson's just not coming. So.
Yeah, it's and Davis, of course, blames Johnson. We have a general without the city, unwilling to fight. That kind of thing. But for all of the blame that Pemberton gets for the fall of Vicksburg, boy, Johnson manages to escape all of that. But I think he's the one to blame.
He really is. He really is. And I guess he just had what we call spin doctoring today.
Yeah.
Because he just basically blames that Yankee over there, So yeah, I told him to get out of there. The place was a trap. Why was he even trying to stay there? So again, completely ignoring not only the political situation where Davis has ordered him to keep Vicksburg, and he's actually shut off the tap of supplies from the West. So yeah, Pemberton had no choice. Yeah. And Pemberton actually says that in some of his writings and stuff like this, that he's decided to hold Vicksburg. He still conceives Vicksburg to be the single most important point in the Confederacy. So Pemberton sees no other way. The loss of Vicksburg, the surrender of Vicksburg would have been a tragedy. It was a tragedy to the South. And yet he does not really have the manpower to come out and challenge Grant directly by himself. And again, Johnson doesn't seem to be willing to cooperate either. So again, man between a rock and a hard place.
And I want to ask you about that when it comes to Champion Hill in a second. Okay. But at what point did things go off the rails for Pemberton? Because he shows up, he does a good job of getting things reorganized, getting defenses laid out. He's connecting pretty well with the officials in Mississippi. He's popular. And then at some point he's not.
Right.
Where do those wheels come off?
All right. So to me, one of the first places is when Johnson's inserted into the chain of command. Johnson, of course, recovers. He wants the Confederate Army back. He's not going to get that. And of course, Davis basically creates a position where he's over Bragg and Pemberton. Prior to that, Pemberton had been reported directly to Davis in the War Department. And I thought I can see that. And again, this is just me trying to crawl inside Pemberton's head where I portray him. He's thinking, wait, they didn't like me in South Carolina. What happened here? Do they not like me here now? So that must have been a blow to his confidence. I just, again, this is nothing written there. This is just me trying to crawl inside the man's head. And that's, to me, that's must have been a ding in Pemberton's confidence. But then Pemberton's a good soldier. So, yes, sir, these are the orders. I follow the orders. Of course, then Johnson pulls his best cavalry away. Then there's another ding. Okay. I can just see that this sort of coming and going. But you can understand how much Pemberton has actually gotten away with. I mean, when Grant had tried to come down the railroad the winter before, the Van Dorn's cavalry raid had turned him back.
Right.
But Johnson, Pemberton had literally won that one. Then, of course, Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, where Sherman comes ashore and Pemberton is moving his men back in via the rail because Grant's retreated. And one of the shortest after-action reports in the war from Sherman, I came, attacked at the point in time, and failed. So again, that would have been a win for Pemberton. Then, of course, Grant spends that whole winter over there across the river trying to find a way to bypass, go around, or get behind Vicksburg, and everything's failing. So technically, that is a win. Technically, you can give that to Mother Nature, maybe instead of Pemberton, but Pemberton is the man, so he'll take the good blame with the bad blame. But anyway, everything seems to be going fine until Grant crosses the river. Mm-hmm. And that's when things start going south because of the lack of cavalry, and Grant's done such a good job of keeping what cavalry was busy with Van Dorn's raid and other things going on all around the state, that Pemberton never knows where to concentrate. I tell him he's playing blind man's bluff with Grant. Where are you? Are you here? Are you there? Are you here? And so I'm trying to put people out everywhere so he's not concentrating his troops anywhere. And Grant, of course, does that lightning thrush up from Port Gibson to Jackson, which got then kept, I thought, caught Pemberton completely off guard because this is not how it was taught in West Point. And even as Grant heads inland, Sherman, of all people, is going to basically say, what are we doing? We need to stop. We need to establish a good supply line. And I can see Grant sort of pat him on the back and said, trust me, I know what I'm doing. And when he gets back to Vicksburg, and Sherman's looking down those bluffs down to the Yazoo River with the Navy unloading supplies down there, he goes all gushing. Oh, it's the greatest campaign in military history. So again, Grant's very out of the box here. And he's really just catching Pemberton off. That's not how this is done. What is he doing? All right. So that's what's going on. And that's where it really starts coming off the wheels once Grant gets across the river. And no matter how hard the Confederates fight, they're simply outnumbered and overwhelmed by Grant everywhere they go. And some of these battles are interesting, how well the battles went for the number of Confederates fighting on the side. I mean, Port Gibson, 8,000 men against 2 corps, and it took all day long. So it's some really interesting stuff in these battles leading up to the attacks on Vicksburg.
Yeah, and then of course comes that fateful decision to come out from Vicksburg to maybe meet Grant, but we're going to leave part of our forces in the city and wait. Are we going to go meet Grant? Are we going to cut a supply line? And and so here's where Pemberton, I think, really kind of gets pinched by Johnson, who's saying, come out and meet me, even as Johnson's fleeing. And Pemberton's trying to make the best out of a really bad set of orders from Johnson and Davis.
Come out and meet me. Okay. So say Pemberton gathers up his whole army, as we know he didn't, and takes them out to meet Grant. Where does that leave Vicksburg? Unguarded. Understand, Grant's over to the east, but there's still Union soldiers across the river, and the Navy's right there on the river. And Vicksburg had been left unguarded. It wouldn't take a whole lot for somebody to come in and secure Vicksburg while Pemberton was out with the whole army. So he knows he can't do that. He's got to leave at least enough men in Vicksburg to give it a fighting chance of any kind of people coming in from across the river on him. So he leaves 2 divisions behind. and he doesn't have as much men as Grant does in start place, and so he marches out. He's very hesitant. You can see that in his actions. He comes out to Bovina, which is right near the Big Black River, just before he crosses the river, over the river bridge, over the railroad bridge, and the pontoons headed east. Then he comes on out to Edwards Station, just a few miles further on, not far from Champion Hill. And then he decides to have a council of war. Well, guys, do we come out and attack Grant in his rear, because by this time Grant's burning Jackson? Or do we go down and cut the supply lines again like we did last year? Okay, so last year, he remembers Van Dorn cut the supply lines, and what did Grant do? He turned around and marched back to Memphis. I'm sure Pemberton must have been thinking, if we do that, he'll do the same thing. Understand, Pemberton has 400 wagons behind him as he's coming out. And he's, in his mind, Grant must have at least twice that many, because he's got more men than I do. So he thinks there's a huge supply line coming up from the river down there, and all we do is go down there, cut that supply line, and that'll be all over. He doesn't realize how light Grant's actually traveling. That, again, that's just outside the box thinking for the day. And Pemberton, although he's a good soldier, he is not the outside the box thinker. And so he turns off. He's going to go down the Raymond Edwards Road. He's going to hit that supply line. And again, here's the comedy of errors. First off, we get out and we discover we don't have enough supplies. Who messed up this? Go turn the train back and get some more. Now, understand, right? Pemberton gets very much criticized by this, but the same thing happened to Grant when he crossed the Grand Gulf. The men landed and discovered they'd had no rations issued. And so they didn't start moving as they hit Grand Gulf until about 4 p.m. because they had to have rations issued. So the same thing happened to Grant. Grant got away with it. Pemberton really didn't. No, so anyway, so then they march out. The bridge is washed out. Well, didn't you send some cavalry scouts out? Apparently not. They go around, they cross through the crossroads, come down, and by the time the day ends, the whole army's made it about 4 or 5 miles straight line distance where they're headed. Just absolute comedy of errors. And then, of course, the fighting starts. And so here's again, I tell people, Grant's having problems too. His corps commander, John McClernand, is on the middle road. 2 divisions down on the Raymond Edwards Road, 2 divisions on the Jackson Road. Had they worked together, attacking at the same time, Battle of Champion Hill would have been over in 20 minutes, and Vicksburg would have fallen that day. But comedy of errors again. Lack of communication between Grant and his subordinates. And the battle goes on all day long. And Pemberton is able to make an orderly retreat back across flooded Baker's Creek and back to Vicksburg. And so, you know, it's errors going on both sides. So Grant decided, people sort of glossed it over with Grant, but Grant's made some mistakes too. And sometimes it's just the fate of the gods of fate looking down on you. Some strange things happen on both sides. But again, that's when it happens. That the champion battle of Champion Hill, you know, some historians have said, you know, the guns of Champion Hill sounded the death knell for Richmond, because Champion Hill was really the last chance Pemberton had to stop Grant before he got to Vicksburg. Yeah. Pulls back to the Big Black River the next day, another battle there. Pemberton is trying to hold the bridgehead on the far side of the Big Black River from Vicksburg, because he's expecting his lost division by General Loring to come. And of course, at the retreat, Loring had gotten turned around and went back the other direction and winds up drowning Joe Johnston. So Pemberton's sitting there at the Big Black River waiting for Loring to catch up, and the men come up out of the Union Army instead. Another fiasco of battle there. The lines quickly break, the bridges are burned too quickly, and they march back into Vicksburg in disorder, complete rout. While Pemberton gets on the train and is riding back to Vicksburg with Major Samuel Lockett, his chief engineer, he turns to Lockett and says, think, 30 years ago today, my career began with much promise, my appointment to a cadetship at the U.S. Military Academy, and today it has ended in disaster and disgrace. right then Pemberton knew it was all over except the shouting.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was going downhill by the time Grant crossed the river, and it didn't stop.
Yeah. And you mentioned Loring a second ago, and I've he's another one who probably puts Pemberton in a really bad spot. And I think
Sure.
about how Champion Hill may have played out differently had Loring been a more cooperative subordinate. You know?
Exactly, exactly. Loring was a very aggressive man. He was not a he was nobody by no means a coward. In fact, he had actually come up through the ranks. He had actually been born in Florida, fighting the Seminoles, ran away to Texas to fight the Texas Revolution. So young, his father went and got him and brought him back. He joined the army pretty much as soon as he was old enough to do so. In the Mexican-American War, he lost his left arm and said he refused any anesthesia and calmly smoked a cigar as the surgeons stitched up the stump of the left arm. He had no respect for West Pointers in general and Pemberton in specific. But by the same token, he had been run out of the East by none other than Stonewall Jackson, who told Lee, "This man leaves my army or I leave it." And so he got packed up and sent west to fight with Pemberton. So this is not going to be an easy character to get along with. You can tell right up in front. And Pemberton is just flabbergasted by his failure to follow orders. At one point, as the Union troops are pushing over Champion's Hill, he's calling to Loring, come up. And Loring says no. And Pemberton's just so flabbergasted, he can't hardly get on his horse. He has to be helped on his horse. And it's not until really the show's almost always over that Loring finally does up and fight the rear action that allows the army to escape back over flooded Baker's Creek, which had been rebuilt by Lockett's men. So yes, I think the wheels could come completely off at Champion Hill.
Yeah. So Pemberton realizes it's all over but the shouting, yet he still holds on for the siege.
Right.
Is there a point where he thinks that this is going to turn out okay for him? Or, is he realistic about thinking that Joe Johnston's going to come to his rescue?
I think he does believe Joe Johnston's coming until it finally becomes evident that Johnston's not. Understand, when the siege first begins, the lines are not completely sealed. And with the rough terrain around Vicksburg, you could actually sneak somebody out of the in and out of the cover of darkness. They could get down to some of these deep, steep hollows and stuff, and if they were quiet enough, they could kind of sneak through. So there has been communication back and forth between Johnston through at least the early part of the siege, and Johnston had constantly assured Pemberton, "He's coming. I'm coming. I'm waiting for one more brigade, but I'm coming." And he just keeps saying that. And Pemberton rashed him back, sent him back. Okay, when are you coming? If you attack along the Jackson Road, I'll attempt to pop out at the Halls Ferry Road. So he's trying to cooperate. He's actually told his men to conserve ammo. There was actually, Grant talks about how much ammo was actually still found in Vicksburg when it surrendered. They weren't out of ammo because Pemberton told them conserve their ammo. Why? Joe Johnston's coming. When he shows up, we're going to combine our forces. We're going to break out. We're going to defeat Timmy. So I think he had hope up until the last minute. But as the time goes on, finally, Joe Johnston sends the definitive message, "I'm not coming. I'm not strong enough." He does actually say at one point, "I'm not strong enough to lift the siege, but I think we can extract the garrison." So Pemberton sends him back, "Okay, if you attack along this road, we'll attempt to pop out down here, and that's what we'll do." So he's taking it, okay, maybe we can't hold Vicksburg, maybe we can extract the army. But that never happens either. And finally, when Joe Johnston sends the definitive message, "I'm not coming," then by this time, that message never makes it to Pemberton. He never then sees that until well after the siege is over. And so he finally is waiting. He looks around the city. I mean, the people of Vicksburg were living in these holes and grounds they call caves. They had started eating their pets. The men in the trenches were down to eating mule meat. Now, if you ever eaten any wild game, it was a little tough sometimes, that's not quite the same as that beef you buy in the supermarket. But mule? That must have been as tough as shoe leather. Yet the men were so hungry, they were talking about how good it was. So yes, you touched showing you how desperate things were around Vicksburg. And of course, Grant has been digging earthworks. He's been digging these big zigzag trenches, closing the gap every day, a little closer, a little closer. You're sitting out there looking, and yesterday they're a couple hundred yards closer today than they were yesterday, and a couple hundred yards closer. And it's just slow, but it's happening, and the end is near. And they've blown up the Fort on Jackson Road twice and hadn't made it in, but it's just by the skin of the teeth that they didn't make it in that last time. And so finally, Pemberton says, okay, he's not coming. And so he turns to John Bowen. John Bowen knew Grant before the war, when Grant was having his tough years, selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis. Bowen had loaned him some money. And so Bowen goes out with a flag of truce to negotiate surrender terms.
Now, Bowen maybe does a little bit of subterfuge to get the two generals together and talking and stuff. Would Pemberton have gotten there on his own, or did it really take Bowen to try to kind of trick the two guys into talking?
I think Bowen knew exactly what he was doing. Pemberton, again, while he is, again, not incompetent, he is a very proud man. Mm-hmm. And he's not going to go, hat in hand out to Grant and say, please, sir, may I have some surrender? So his idea is, okay, John Bowen knows Grant before the war, so he'll go out and talk to him. Of course, has on the flag of truce, the riders ride up to him. What you want, Reb? I'm here to see General Grant. So they send word back to Grant, and Grant says, I'm not talking to John Bowen. He's not the man in charge. I'm only going to talk to Pemberton coming out. And so, of course, this is basically a brush off, I'm not talking to you. Bowen goes back to Pemberton and says, not that Grant wouldn't talk to me, but General Grant would like to talk to you. So again, in Pemberton's response is not written down anywhere I found out, but I saw to interpret it when Kurt and I do a program about the last 24 hours of the series of Vicksburg. And so one thing I put where Pemberton's words in his mouth. I always say, okay, when I get the information, well, we're both West Pointers by definition, officers and gentlemen. I'm sure we can meet face to face and work something out. And so Pemberton comes out, and there's a little scraggly oak tree out on the battlefield, just a few hundred yards out in front of the stockade Berdan, and that's where the two men meet. And Pemberton turns to Grant and says, what terms will you give me if I surrender Vicksburg? And Grant sort of says, I can imagine just taking a cigar of his mouth, no terms, unconditional surrender. And Pemberton angrily snaps, sir, you will bury many more of your men before unconditionally surrender Vicksburg. Turns to mount his horse and go back. But here's where the subordinate generals started to come in. And I can imagine John Bowen reaching over and grabbing Pemberton on the back. Sir, General Pemberton, why don't you let me work this out? I'll get over here with General so-and-so, and we'll get this together. And so subordinate generals on both sides started to go back and forth talking, and Pemberton and Grant are going to simply wander away over on the side of the hill and reminisce about the Mexican-American War for a while. Now, what happens again, this is exactly 24 hours from the time Bowen goes out with the white flag of truce until the city surrenders. So late that evening, late that night, it's after about 10 o'clock, Ryder comes in with Grant's first draft of terms of surrender. The officer's going to keep their sidearms and one horse apiece. The men will have their clothes and whatever supplies they need, and blah, blah, blah. We're about to sign parole documents and stuff, and then they'll be able to march out. Of course, Pemberton wants to march out with colors flying and all property intact, and that's a no-go. It's not going to happen. And of course, by property, Pemberton's obviously talking about slaves. Grant's not going to allow that. In the end, the officers will get their horses and their sidearms, the men their clothes and whatever supplies they need. But everybody will have to sign a parole document. And of course, by this, they agreed to not take up any kind of military duties and such forth. They are properly exchanged. And finally, just after midnight, terms are finalized, and Pemberton turns and sends a message out accepting the final terms. And Grant turns to his subordinates, gentlemen, Vicksburg has surrendered. 10 o'clock the next morning, white flags go up on the parapets. The Confederates march out and start stacking their arms in front of their works. They return to Vicksburg. Union columns move in. They go right down the Jackson Road to the old courthouse, which is the museum today. They pull down the Confederate flag and unfurl this monstrous American flag. And stars and stripes fly once more over Vicksburg. That was 10 o'clock, and that happened at 10 o'clock in the morning, July 4th, exactly 24 hours from the time this negotiations began.
And I think about that famous statement Pemberton made when he's like, I know my people of the North and they'll give us better terms on the 4th of July. And he doesn't get those terms. And like the surrender just doesn't unfold the way he had ever imagined it would.
Right.
Put me in his boots for a second as that's all going on.
He is obviously a very bitter man. He feels like he's been betrayed by his superior, General Joe Johnston. And he will actually be not his headquarters, but on a house called the Rock House, which is on a high knoll out on the Jackson Road inside the works, but much farther out from the city limits of Vicksburg. That house no longer exists, although the high hill is still there. And as Grant comes in, he goes up to the Rock House there, and Pemberton basically doesn't even speak to him. He's just sitting there, sort of mean mugging him and stuff like this. And Grant sticks out his hand, no response, and finally asks for some water. Pemberton says, "Some inside." He walks through. There's a slave out on the back porch. There's a cistern. Vicksburg doesn't have wells. Has big underground catchments for holding water called cisterns, rainwater. And that slave dishes him out some water. And that's sort of prophetic, because, who is this done for? You're freeing the slaves. So they're obviously the ones who totally had the greatest gratitude. Now, of course, Pemberton will be paroled along with everybody else. And he'll be ordered to go report to his superior, which is Joe Johnston. So some 10 days after the surrenders are all the paroles are signed and they march out together, he finally said he found General Joe Johnston on a moonlit hill just outside the little town of Canton. He walks up the hill toward him, and as he gets close enough for Johnston to recognize who it is, he jumps out of his chair and sticks out his hand, and Pemberton coldly refuses the hand and salutes. "Sir, by order of General Grant, I report to you, my superior." Turned and walked away. So, yeah, he's a very bitter man. He feels like he's been betrayed by his adopted country and his superiors. The men were supposed to come help, never did. So, yes, he's not a gracious loser. So he's
like now instantly he's the most radioactive man in the Confederacy. Right. And Jefferson Davis still feeling some loyalty to him and recognizing that Pemberton did a good job as well as he could based on the circumstances, tries to find him another job. And so there's like a third act to Pemberton's story here, but it's a lot different than we might suspect.
So he is he's a lieutenant general. He's one of the highest ranking generals in the Confederacy. So there's not like just abundant positions out there. So you can imagine, all right, if I'm a lieutenant general and you're going to put another lieutenant general on my staff or on our people, who's in charge? Feeling is sort of said, and so you can also see, well, again, he's also the Yankee who lost Vicksburg too, isn't he? And he's radioactive. He's bad luck all of a sudden. So nobody really wants him. There's an attempt to put him in with Bragg and some other things like this, but it goes back and forth. And it just doesn't happen. By the way, before that even happened, Pemberton wanted a court-martial. He wanted a chance to prove his case because these rumors had begun to spread that he was in collusion the whole time. And again, a lot of that I think was probably disinformation on the Union side. There's rumors or stories of the Unions in the trenches and stuff like this when they get close enough, they can talk to the Confederacy at night. They're hollering out, "Hey, Reb, your general's one of us. He's going to sell you out." "Ah, you lying rank yank." And then surrenders July 4th. Oh my God, they were telling the truth. And so the
Yeah.
rumors went like wildfire all around the line that he had been sold out. And how it is even today. Rumors, once they get started, don't need basis in fact to gain traction. So Pemberton wants his day in court. He wants a chance to prove his innocence, but it requires a court of his peers. He's a lieutenant general. It's just not like we can pull a bunch of lieutenant generals off the line at this point in the war.
Right.
And so this never happens. And so after sitting idle for several months, he goes to Davis and says, "Just give me a place to fight." By some accounts, he actually said, "If I have to just pick up a musket and go join the men in the trenches, I'll do that." In the end, Davis will find a fighting position, but he finally winds up in the artillery defense around Richmond, but at the rank of lieutenant colonel. Now, this was voluntarily; he was not demoted; it was not a punishment because, again, Davis liked him. So he will be in the artillery defense around Richmond as a lieutenant colonel. And by all accounts, he fought very bravely. And he right there toward the end of the war, he'll be promoted to Inspector General of Artillery, whatever that is. So I think this was more or less a creative position, just so he could call himself general again. So but of course, by this time the war's almost over. About this time, Richmond falls. Davis does his attempt to escape, and Pemberton actually wrote to him later on after he was in prison, basically saying that he had tried to catch up with him, but he just never quite could. He wanted to join him or something like that. So, for whatever he did or not, I don't know. But then he will, after the war is over, he'll settle in Virginia for a while. Now, again, his family was still a very important family in Philadelphia. His father was long dead, but his mother was still along. Mother was sort of the matriarch of the family. And so she sort of takes pity on young John. She loans you some money so you can buy the land in Virginia. He'll eventually reconcile with the friends and family in Philadelphia and return to the area. So, and then, of course, we've got the post-war Joe Johnson memoirs. Where Joe Johnson says this, you might as well have been titled, "It's not my fault, blame the Yankee." And he just basically barbecues Pemberton. And of course, here's what it is. Pemberton had friends. There were men who knew Pemberton both before and after, and those who supported him and knew that he was a good soldier. And they keep encouraging him to respond to that. And of course, the way to respond to that is you write your own memoirs. So, it's and Pemberton seems putting it off, basically saying, no, my reputation should stand for itself, and it doesn't.
Yeah.
He will eventually start writing for the memoirs, but he'll die in 1881, age of 66, before he completes it. The manuscript is given by his wife to a gentleman who was putting together a collection of papers of the Civil War, and it's basically lost to history for almost the rest of another century. It resurfaces in somebody's, I don't know if it's a yard sale or an attic or something like that, somewhere. It resurfaces in the late 80s, early 90s, is finally published long after he was gone. Over 100 years after he was gone. So it's called Compelled to Appear in Print. If you ever want to find it, read it. It's very dry reading, by the way. So,
well, thanks for taking that hit for us, because obviously you've had to do it.
Yeah.
But I think though, like when he volunteers to become a lieutenant colonel, to me that's an extraordinary decision. It says a lot about his character and what his values and where his loyalties really were.
I think it does, really, because he could have easily just hung on to his general title, and he probably could have been found him a place in the bureaucracy of the Confederate War Department or something like that. I'm sure they could have created a desk job for him. So he would have been a good desk. He was good at desk work, no shame in that. I mean, armies need paperwork too, but he wanted to fight. And so in order to fight, he takes a reduction in rank. He does it voluntarily. It was his idea. So I see that is actually shows his character, his qualities of character. But again, his reputation is going to be poisoned by this, and for the next 100 years or so, people are simply going to say, "Oh, he's that fool that lost Vicksburg." And I look at it today and I try to think, is there anybody in the Confederacy who was given the same problems that Pemberton had that could have done a better job? And I just don't see it, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was just outnumbered in every way. He had problems with loyalty among his own troops and his superiors, because not only has he had Loring left him, Joe Johnston left him twisting in the wind. And so he doesn't have enough men, doesn't have enough guns, don't have enough cavalry. He knows it. But he's the one who took the fall for it.
So if you were to recommend to folks, like, I want you to just rethink this guy. You don't have to be his fan, but we want to understand, what went on. What would you want people to walk away with as far as just how to reconsider John Pemberton?
John Pemberton was by no means a Robert E. Lee or a U.S. Grant. He was not one of the great generals of the war, but he was a good, solid soldier. And how many times in many places had a good, solid soldier been the man for the job? So he is, again, not to be remembered as one of the great heroes of the war, but he does not deserve the name of fool or incompetent that he's been given since. He was simply a man who was overwhelmed by superior numbers and superior logistics in every way, and abandoned by his own side in certain significant ways. Although Davis never really abandoned him, his commander, Joe Johnston, did, and his subordinate, John Loring, did. So again, he was a man, he was the perfect storm of everything going wrong, basically. That's what happened to him. And up to that point in his life, he'd been doing pretty good. But 1863 was the year that brought him low.
Is there something that people could read to find out more about Pemberton that you think is like a fair treatment?
There's not a lot of written about him, but one of the best is by Paul Ballard. He's got a book out on John C. Pemberton, and he does a very fair, balanced job of it. There's also an older book written by John Pemberton's grandson, who was also named John C. Pemberton. It's a little bit more slanted in that it is, it's my memoir of my grandpa, basically type thing. But it does give a lot of firsthand accounts in it about what Pemberton's thinking, things from his journal and stuff like this is going on. So that gives a little bit more picture into the mind of, again, Ballard's probably the best, most balanced, modern, readable version. Failed to compare it to appear compelled to appear in print again is out there, but again, it's very dry reading. So.
Yeah. And I'll also just encourage folks to get out to Vicksburg and walk the ground, and you can walk in Pemberton's footsteps.
Sure can. Yeah. So come on down and see us here. I'm one of the licensed guys here in Vicksburg. You can get a licensed guy to ride along with you, and it makes the battlefield come to life.
It does. It does. Morgan, thanks so much for spending some time with us today.
Right. Glad I could do it. Glad I could join you.
So I'm
you.
Chris. Yeah. I'm Chris Mikowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.